Supply-side economics widened the gap between rich and the poor. More money was in the hands of investors and high-income Americans. But for those at the bottom of the economic ladder, the decade was one of growing frustration and hardship. By the mid-1980s, roughly 35 million Americans lived below the official poverty line, which was $10,000 per year for a family of 4. The percentage of poor people had increased from roughly 11.5% in the 1970s to 15% in the 1980s. The standard of living for the middle class remained the same. Economic policies benefited mainly yuppies and upper-income groups. We also had a rising federal deficit, over $200 billion per year. This happened because Reagan cut taxes so much while he also increased military spending drastically. This led to the debate about what government programs should be cut to help reduce the deficit. Over 8 years, the national debt would triple from $900 billion to $2.7 trillion. These tax cuts stimulated consumption more than investment, especially in foreign-made luxury and consumer items. The use of credit increased in the lower and middle classes, which became saddled with more and more debt. All these contributed to an increased trade deficit, which reached $150 billion per year. Over 8 years, it was $1 trillion, which led to more foreign ownership in U.S. real estate and industry. The net effect was that by 1985, the U.S. had become a debtor nation for the first time since World War I. Deregulation led to questionable banking practices like the savings and loan crisis. Savings and loans had traditionally been conservative financial institutions, or banks, that funneled individual savings into safe home mortgages. Under new rules, they began to compete for deposits by offering high interest rates and in reinvesting the money in much riskier commercial real estate. By 1990, the result was a financial crisis in which bad loans destroyed hundreds of savings and loans, especially in the Southwest. American taxpayers were left to bail out depositors to the tune of $500 billion to prevent a collapse of the nation's financial and credit system. With the deregulation of financial markets, corporate consolidations and mergers flourished. Critics of Reaganomics suggested that his policies also contributed to the stock market crash on October 19, 1987, also known as Black Monday. The stock market crashed 22%, starting a worldwide crash that would take several years for the world markets to recover from. Since the 1920s, Americans have waged a culture war against itself, beginning with the traditional versus modern value struggle showcased in the Scopes monkey trial. The culture war refers to the idea that there are two cultural classes in the U.S., and that these two groups engage in a constant battle over values. Many times it has been simplified into a clash between liberals and conservatives. It came to prominence in the 1980s with the shift of many Americans to a more conservative mindset. An increasing number of hot-button issues such as race, abortion, gun control, gay rights, education, religion, drugs, and feminism drove Americans to the two opposing sides of those issues. Society divided itself, creating two warring groups defined by their ideological views. For example, conservatives fought back against the rise of feminism of the 1970s, with evangelical Christians leading the charge. Their claim was that the changing gender roles and sexuality was a threat to American way of life. This conflict became possible because of the end of the Cold War, a unifying event that Americans generally agreed on. Probably the single most influential thing that a president can do is nominate a judge to the Supreme Court. It's important because a Supreme Court justice serves for life, or until they choose to retire. Reagan appointed conservatives Antonin Scalia, Anthony Kennedy, Sandra Day O'Connor, and William Rehnquist as Chief Justice. His goal was to create a more conservative Supreme Court to correct or reform social issues like abortion. Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice, was a moderate conservative who refused to overturn Roe v. Wade and was the deciding vote in the Bush v. Gore case in 2000. She retired in 2006 and was replaced by Samuel Alito. The presidential election of 1984 was a contest between the incumbent President Ronald Reagan, the Republican candidate, and former Vice President Walter Mondale, the Democratic candidate. Mondale chose Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate, the first woman to run for vice president in U.S. history. Reagan was helped by a strong economic recovery from a deep recession of 1981 and 1982. Reagan carried 49 of the 50 states, becoming only the second presidential candidate to do so after Richard Nixon's victory in the 1972 presidential election. Mondale's only electoral votes came from Washington, D.C. and his home state of Minnesota, which he won by less than 3,800 votes. Reagan's 525 electoral votes is the highest total ever received by a presidential candidate. Over 2 million non-legal immigrants had taken advantage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, also known as the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, to legalize their presence in the U.S. The act made it illegal to knowingly hire or recruit unauthorized immigrants, legalized certain seasonal agricultural illegal immigrants, and legalized illegal immigrants who entered the U.S. before January 1, 1982, and had resided there continuously, with the penalty of a fine, paying back taxes, and providing an admission of guilt. About 3 million illegal immigrants were granted legal status. Some employers began discriminating against workers who appeared foreign, resulting in a small reduction in the overall Hispanic employment. For those businesses who hired Hispanics, wages were often lowered to compensate employers for the perceived risk of hiring foreigners. The Reagan administration launched a war on drugs and supported moves to prosecute users as well as dealers. First Lady Nancy Reagan toured the country with an anti-drug campaign that admonished students to just say no to drugs. There are still hundreds of Just Say No clinics and school clubs in operation around the country, aimed at helping and rehabilitating children and teenagers with drug problems. Reagan signed a large drug enforcement bill into law in 1987. It granted $1.7 billion to fight drugs and ensured a mandatory minimum penalty for drug offenses. The bill was criticized for promoting significant racial disparities in the prison population. Education became another issue that stirred people's concerns. In 1983, a federal commission issued a report on education titled A Nation at Risk. The report revealed that American students lagged behind students in most other industrialized nations. In addition, the report stated that 23 million Americans were unable to follow an instruction manual or fill out a job application form. The Commission's findings touched off a debate about the quality of education. The Commission recommended more homework, longer school days, and an extended school year. It also promoted increased pay and merit raises for teachers, as well as a greater emphasis on basic subjects such as English, math, science, social studies, and computer science. AIDS, or Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, became an epidemic in the 1980s. It is a virus that attacks human immune systems. Victims don't die from AIDS, they die from complications from AIDS, many times dying from pneumonia. AIDS began in Africa. It is transferred through bodily fluids. Initially, there were 3 types of groups that contracted AIDS: homosexual men, intravenous drug users who shared their needles, and patients who received tainted blood transfusions. However, this last part no longer holds true. Every segment of society today is affected by AIDS. The most rapidly growing segments in American society that are contracting AIDS today are young heterosexuals. There is an alarming number of heterosexual African American females that are getting AIDS. There is no cure for AIDS. In 1987, to show support for people with AIDS, groups got together and created an AIDS quilt. Each panel honors a person who died of the disease. By December of 2000, 36.1 million people worldwide were living with AIDS, an equal number of which were men and women. Home computers entered the market in 1977 and became very common throughout the 1980s. They were marketed to consumers as affordable and accessible computers that, for the first time, were intended for the use of a single non-technical user. Their most common uses were playing video games, but they were also regularly used for word processing, doing homework, and programming. Young computer entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak for Apple and Bill Gates for Microsoft revolutionized the industry.